Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution states, "The Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes." And in 1845, the Congress determined that time would be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It's not a direct election, as the United States isn't a direct democracy. What Americans are doing is choosing a certain number of electors, the number based on each state's population and representation in Congress, and those electors then cast the deciding votes for president. There are 538 electors in all, and it takes just over half of them, 270, to decide the presidency. Could there be a tie? Unlikely, but possible. Who would choose the president then? The House of Representatives. What about the Senate? It would choose the vice president. Why is this so complicated? Well, the Founding Fathers ensured that every state, regardless of its population, would have some degree of a say in national elections. A candidate can't just go to big cities, win their votes, ignore rural places, and call it a win. The framers also wanted to limit the electoral power of the average voter and put the ultimate decision in the hands of electors believed to be more in tune with politics. So the Electoral College was born. It's a controversial system, and there have been several elections when a candidate won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College and therefore lost the election. But the system's held up despite hundreds of challenges through the centuries, and it'll come into play again today in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Hi, my name is Carl Azuz. Welcome to our Election Day edition of The World from A to Z, your nonpartisan source for news and international events. So much media coverage has centered on Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party's nominee for president, and former President Donald Trump, the Republican Party's nominee for president. But today's election isn't just about the presidency.
In a nation of more than 330 million, the U.S. voting process is complicated. People have a say in local, state, and federal positions, and these elections all overlap, voting all kinds of positions at the same time, from things like local soil and water conservation supervisor to the president. Then there are logistics, a staggering 10,000 voting jurisdictions across more than 3,000 U.S. counties, each deciding things like how to print ballots, when polls open and close, or if polling stations will have wheelchair ramps.
So there's a lot more to all this than who gets to spend the next 4 years at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And regardless of who wins that job, he or she is going to need to work with Congress to implement a lot of the plans talked about on the campaign trail. There are 435 voting seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. All of them are up for election today. There are 100 seats in the U.S. Senate. About a third of them are up for election today. If these chambers wind up being controlled by different political parties, as they are now, or if one or both of them are controlled by a different party than the presidency, compromise will be the name of the game for the president to accomplish any legislative priorities, because Democrats tend to oppose Republicans' policies and Republicans tend to oppose Democrats' policies. So the makeup of the Senate and House are important in determining how smoothly things go for the president when it comes to legislation. We'll bring you the latest results we have in tomorrow's show. We might have clear projections for the presidency and Congress. We might not if states are delayed in reporting votes, if close recounts have been triggered, or if the outcomes are too close for political experts to make projections. So I'm probably going to be losing sleep over the election, but only because I'm working. Still, given all the political attacks and political hyperbole surrounding the vote, not to mention being bombarded by politics on social media, many anxious Americans have lost sleep over this. What are some ways to cope with that?
If this election is causing you to lose sleep, you're not alone.
We call it electsomnia, so it's insomnia linked with the election season.
Sleep specialist Michelle Drera with Cleveland Clinic says in her clinical practice, she's seeing more people being triggered with election-related sleep issues. She says the election can worsen symptoms in those who already struggle with insomnia and can also trigger sleep issues in those who don't have chronic sleep problems.
The person has difficulty falling asleep and they may be kind of thinking about the election or potentially what the future might look like, waking up in the middle of the night and struggling to fall back asleep, or even just poor sleep quality.
Drerup says to prioritize sleep before you even go to bed by limiting social media and election news exposure, which can worsen stress and add to sleep difficulties. Also, be aware of your negative thoughts and challenge them.
Just try to stay in the moment of where things are at right now.
Finally, Drerup says not to focus on the election what-ifs, instead zone in on things you can manage.
We have survived many elections. We'll get through this, right? It's only 4 years. So thinking about what I can do versus a lot of what's out of my control.
I'm Mandy Gaither.
On this date in world history. On November 5th, 1872, women's rights activist Susan B. Anthony voted in the U.S. presidential election. But Carl, you might be asking, wasn't that like 48 years before American women got the right to vote? It was. But Anthony argued the 14th Amendment guaranteed her voting rights. A judge ruled it didn't and fined her $100 for voting illegally, but she never paid it. Several U.S. presidents were elected or re-elected on this date in history, but in 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the first and only American leader elected to a third term in office. He also won again 4 years later. The 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951, has since limited presidents to 2 terms in office. And this was the date in 1943 when a pilot dropped several bombs on Vatican City during World War II. No one was killed, but there was significant damage. The city was neutral and off limits for the Allied and Axis powers, and for decades there have been conflicting reports and considerable debate about who did it.
Word of knowledge. Whose face appeared in the U.S. dime before President Franklin D. Roosevelt's picture was added in 1946? Susan B. Anthony, Running Antelope, Lady Liberty, William McKinley. Before President Roosevelt was added in part because he supported the March of Dimes for polio research, several versions of the coin featured Lady Liberty.
Take a look at an ultra-rare dime that just sold for $500,000. Let me explain. Normally, the ubiquitous 10-cent piece is, well, a dime a dozen, so to speak, nothing special. But according to auction house Great Collections, this 1975 dime is a very rare exception indeed. Why? Because of this, the absence of a tiny letter S that adorns all dimes struck at the U.S. Proof Mint in San Francisco. See, there it is, right there. Great Collections says the S-less dime is infinitely rarer with this error. It's certainly more interesting, or should I say interesting. In fact, it's one of only 2 examples known to exist and was purchased by an Ohio family in 1978 and held for almost 50 years before being consigned and garnering more than 200 bids, ultimately selling for a record-setting $506,000 and change.
Moving from coast to coast to check in with our viewers today, we've got the Bulldogs hunkered down at Bethel Middle School, Mrs. Martin's class. Great to see y'all in Spanaway, Washington, the Evergreen State. In the sunflower state of Kansas, not to be confused with the natural state of Arkansas, it's great to have Mrs. Flax's class with us from Ness City Junior Senior High School. The Eagles are in Ness City, America's heartland. And from the Bay State of Massachusetts, we welcome Mr. Avruk's class. Edward M. Kennedy Academy for Health Careers is in the city of Boston. Not all historians agree on whether the French Queen Marie Antoinette really said let them eat cake. But if you're ever on the lookout for a cake fit for a queen, then look no further than this fair in the United Kingdom. What look like really detailed wax sculptures of British royals, Victorian shopkeepers, and the odd Roman sea god are mostly made of cake. It's not all edible. In addition to chocolate, sugar, and flour paste, there's plastic and wood under some of these creations. But when it comes to dessert that's more like dessert, you can easily see how judges would get buttered up and fans would be so fondant of a multi-layered event that turns pounds of angel food upside down with an abundance of icing that even a king wouldn't care it to velvet before having a bite and proclaiming, "That takes the cake, y'all." I'm Carl Azuz, baking up puns. We hope you enjoyed our Election Day coverage, and we'll come back for seconds tomorrow on The World from A to Z. You mean the world to me.